the English coast in the early Middle Ages. Each summer, pirates descended here. They were looking for children. Boys were sold as slaves. Girls as maidservants or worse, often by their own families. Wulfstan, Bishop of Worcester, was one of the few to speak out against this trade in human souls.
You would have groaned to see the files of wretches being put up for sale. An accursed deed that men should condemn to slavery their own flesh and blood.
In the modern world, we accept, at least in principle, that we are all equal. Some people may be richer or have better opportunities, but nonetheless, equality is our ideal. In the medieval world, that wasn't the view at all. You were born and lived and died in radical inequality. Whatever position in life you were born to, baron or knight, peasant or slave, that was where you belonged. For centuries, this harsh system governed the medieval world. But a long revolution would transform relations between those with power and those with none. Life in the early 11th century was almost unimaginably different from our own. Inequality and oppression were part of the natural order, ordained by God. This was a class system of staggering extremes, and every class had an exact price. Just like an animal, a human life could be measured in pounds, shillings, and pence. If a person was murdered, the victim's family could pursue the killer for compensation, known as wergild, literally man price. That price depended on the victim's status. It was paid in shillings. 5 shillings was the cost of a cow. If you killed a mere peasant, you paid 200 shillings, the price of around 40 cows. If you killed a nobleman, you paid a hefty 1,200 shillings. A noble's life was worth 6 times a peasant's. The value of your life was determined by the class into which you were born. Medieval writers divided society into 3 fixed classes or orders. There were those who pray, the monks and priests, about 5% of the population. Those who fight, another 5%, the nobles and knights. And then all the rest, the third order, those who work. A huge majority of people at the beginning of the Middle Ages toiled as serfs on the estates of the wealthy landowners. This was a rigid world in which your class was as much a part of you as the colour of your skin. If you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant. And the legacy of this early apartheid survives even in the language we use today. The word gentleman comes from the same Latin root as our modern word gene. It means literally someone who is well born. Your class was literally in your genes. Those at the bottom of the scale were born to a life of hardship. Serfs had to work on their lord's land. They also scratched a living from the small plots he granted them. The 14th century poet William Langland described the lot of peasant women.
They suffer much hunger and wake at midnight, to card and to comb, to rub and to reel. The woe of these women who dwell in hovels is too sad to speak of or to say in rhyme.
The peasant class were regarded as a sort of working breeding stock. A serf couldn't get married without his lord's permission, and nor could he leave. He belonged to the lord's estate. In legal terms, he was tied to the soil. The law even stated earls and barons may sell their serfs like oxen or cattle. And if you tried to escape from your lord's estate, you were punished. Medieval lords went to great lengths to recapture their runaway serfs, with the full backing of the king, who ordered his officials to arrest them and return them. And lords claimed the right to put their serfs in stocks. Stocks have a rather comical reputation nowadays, but the reality was very different. They were a humiliating and painful punishment. Imagine what it would be like to be in here for 2 hours. The cramp, the discomfort. Where, for example, did you relieve yourself? And what if you were in them not for 2 hours, but for 2 days? One Northumbrian peasant decided he couldn't take any more.
His lord had frequently burdened him with heavy and wrongful claims, extorting many things above his yearly rent. He gathered together all he had and set out with his wife and sons, his oxen, sheep, and lambs.
The runaway peasant was hotly pursued by the lord and his men, anxious to recover what they saw as their property.
The cart and the cries of the herdsmen struck the ear. Oxen mooed, sheep baaed, horses neighed, and men shouted at the animals so that the air resounded with the din.
The fugitive finally found a safe haven on the remote island of Lindisfarne. But his story is a rare exception. For most serfs, there was no escape. Even in the great wildernesses of medieval England, inequality was enforced by law. In the Middle Ages, around a third of the country was forest. Huge swathes of land where deer and wild boar roamed. Wherever you lived, it was likely to be within walking distance. But the forest was a dangerous place. These ancient trees were the site of medieval class war. Forest didn't mean just woodland, but any land under the law of the forest. Only the king, or those he favoured, had the right to hunt here. And if a piece of land that wasn't already forest caught the king's fancy, he could turn it into one. When William the Conqueror came across this heathland 20 miles from his royal city of Winchester, he was enchanted. Wouldn't it be a wonderful place to thunder across on horseback, the hounds baying, to hunt boar and chase deer? He turned it into his own personal pleasure ground, Nova Foresta, the new forest. To create this royal playground, between 30 and 40 villages had to be brought under the forest law. Inhabitants were evicted and strict laws enforced. The rich could buy hunting rights from the king. The poor couldn't even carry hunting weapons. The forests were policed by the king's spies, the hated foresters.